No one expected. Just one signature in Ouagadougou would make all three capitals, Washington, Paris, Brussels, dizzy. The red number appeared, $15 billion. The map of Africa zoomed in on Burkina Faso, shining like a small dot of fire, challenging the world map. The Traoré Modi handshake was more than diplomacy. It was a bang on the table declaring, the old order is over. A country called poor just laid the foundation for Africa's new economy. According to Reuters, Burkina Faso signed a landmark $15 billion oil and infrastructure agreement with India in August 2025. The deal includes investments in oil extraction, refining, petrochemicals, defense production, and manufacturing. Prime Minister Narendra Modi emphasized that the partnership would secure energy for India while creating thousands of jobs in Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré declared it a new era of African sovereignty, insisting the pact was based on equality, not dependency. The announcement stunned analysts across Europe and the United States, who warned it could reshape alliances and energy flows across Africa. The hall was thick with silence when Ibrahim Traoré lifted his pen. Around him, diplomats whispered, journalists adjusted their cameras, and the West held its breath from thousands of miles away. With each stroke of ink, the young president of Burkina Faso rewrote not only a contract, but the very grammar of power. For decades, Africa's story had been drafted elsewhere in boardrooms in Paris, in the corridors of Washington, in the marble offices of Brussels. Burkina Faso was a name on a balance sheet, a pawn in someone else's strategy. But on that day, Traoré shifted the script. The agreement with India was not a loan designed to choke future generations, nor a charity wrapped in strings. It was capital planted in African soil. Factories, pipelines, and steel mills would rise where only dust had stood. For the first time in living memory, the deal carried the possibility that the farmer's son in Kaya or the miner's daughter in Houndé might see their labor transformed into schools, lights, and wages not siphoned away into foreign accounts. And yet, as Traoré signed, he knew the weight of suspicion pressing down on him. Western commentators filled their columns with sneers. Too young, too reckless, too naive. They said Burkina Faso would crumble under the pressure of such a gamble. They whispered that the deal was a mirage, another headline to be forgotten, another African dream destined to be strangled by corruption. But Traoré was not signing for applause. He was signing for the youth who studied by candlelight, the workers who bent their backs in silence, the mothers who prayed their children would not inherit chains disguised as treaties. His hand was steady. His voice was firm. This, he declared, is not dependency. This is dignity. The morning after the signing, Ouagadougou woke to a different rhythm. Radios buzzed in taxis, market women argued over millet, and everywhere, one question hung in the air: will this change my life? In the crowded buses of Bobo Dioulasso, men debated if factories would finally employ their sons. In Kaya's dusty fields, farmers wondered if tractors and irrigation systems might finally ease their burden. Hope and doubt wrestled in equal measure. For every headline promising Africa's rise, there were memories of past betrayals, deals signed with fanfare only to rot in the shadows of corruption. Traoré understood this distrust. He had seen how foreign aid was dressed in the language of compassion, but delivered as chains. He knew how loans with fine print transformed into unpayable debts, how partnerships meant resources exported at cut-rate prices while locals were left with crumbs. This time had to be different. That was why he demanded transparency. That was why he insisted the factories be built in Burkina Faso, with Burkinabe workers trained by Indian engineers, not flown in as overseers. Every clause he fought for was a shield against exploitation, a small guarantee that the people would see the fruit of their soil. Still, danger lurked. Western capitals were already uneasy. Analysts whispered about the collapse of traditional alliances. Think tanks in Washington warned of geopolitical destabilization. European newspapers painted Traoré as reckless, a soldier playing statesman. Some even suggested sanctions, punishment for daring to choose a path outside the orbit of Paris or Brussels. But in the villages, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether the lights would turn on, whether the jobs would arrive, whether their children would finally dream beyond survival. In the quiet of the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré stared out at the city lights flickering against the horizon. He whispered to himself, almost as a vow, this pact must not be another promise. It must be a rebirth. The weeks that followed were a storm. In Washington, think tanks warned that Burkina Faso's pivot toward India could destabilize Western influence in Africa. In Paris, newspapers screamed of betrayal, accusing Traoré of abandoning France, the so-called traditional partner. Brussels muttered about sanctions, while television pundits painted him as reckless, a radical soldier in over his head. But inside Burkina Faso, the story was different. Traoré toured the dusty plains and crowded markets, not as a distant head of state, but as a son among his people. In Dori, mothers wrapped in bright fabric asked him directly, "Will this deal put food on our tables?" In Fada Ngurma, young men pressed him, "Will we finally find jobs, or will foreigners take them?" He did not hide behind prepared speeches. He answered with conviction, "This contract is not charity, it is investment. The oil beneath our feet will not only fuel ships to India, it will power our own schools, hospitals, and factories. And you, the people, will be the ones to build them." And for Traoré, it was not enough to sign a deal. He had to translate it into belief. He knew his greatest ally was not Modi, nor diplomats, nor generals. It was the trust of his own citizens. If they lost faith, no agreement, no billions, no signatures could save the vision. Meanwhile, whispers of sabotage reached his ears. Intelligence reported that certain elites, former ministers with ties to France, businessmen entangled with European companies, were plotting to slow the reforms. They feared losing their privileges more than they feared poverty for their people. Still, Traoré pressed forward. He summoned his ministers and declared, "If 1 cent is stolen, if 1 job is denied to a Burkina worker, if 1 factory rises without training our youth, then this pact will have failed, and history will not forgive us." Night fell heavy over Ouagadougou, yet the palace lights burned bright. Traoré stood over a map of Burkina Faso, spread across a wooden table. Red circles marked the planned refinery sites, blue pins marked the steel factories, and green lines traced the future pipelines. It was not just infrastructure, it was a blueprint of liberation. But every bold plan carries its shadow. Advisors warned him that Western intelligence agencies were probing, whispering to opposition figures, stirring doubts among the people. Some foreign investors quietly withdrew from smaller projects, claiming uncertainty. Rumors spread through markets that the $15 billion was a lie, that the pact was a trick, that nothing would ever change. Traoré clenched his fist. He had seen this playbook before. The West did not always need bullets. Whispers could be deadlier. A rumor could unravel trust faster than a bomb. So he chose a weapon of his own: transparency. He ordered the details of the India agreement published publicly. Every clause laid bare for the people to read. Radio stations across Burkina Faso recited the breakdown. Billions for oil and refining, billions more for steel, energy, and defense. Villagers who had never held a contract now spoke of petrochemicals and power grids as if it were their own household budget. And something remarkable happened. Instead of breeding suspicion, the transparency bred pride. In Koudougou, welders debated how quickly the new factories could open. In Wahiguya, students dreamed of scholarships to study engineering in India. The narrative was shifting from doubt to ownership. But Traoré knew pride alone would not be enough. He warned his closest circle, "Our enemies will not forgive this. They will use corruption, propaganda, even violence to stop us. This is not only an oil deal, it is a battlefield." And indeed, far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, strategies were being drawn. The West, long accustomed to Africa's obedience, now faced a leader who refused to kneel. And the world was beginning to notice. The first shipments of oil left Burkina Faso under a new flag of trade. Not bound for Europe, not controlled by Western banks, tankers cut eastward toward India, carrying with them not only crude, but a message. Burkina Faso chooses its partners on its own terms. The ripple was immediate. In Paris, ministers demanded emergency meetings, fearing that if Burkina Faso succeeded, other African nations might follow. In Washington, analysts warned Congress that Ibrahim Traoré was reshaping the geopolitical chessboard of Africa. And in Brussels, officials whispered of sanctions, their tone more desperate than commanding. But inside Africa, the headlines were different. Newspapers in Mali and Senegal ran stories of Burkina Faso's new dawn. Leaders in Ghana and Ivory Coast sent delegations quietly to Ouagadougou, curious to see how the deal had been struck. The Africa news cycle began to revolve not around tragedy, but possibility. For Traoré, this was the true revolution. He did not want Burkina Faso to stand alone, he wanted the continent to awaken. Every factory that broke ground in his country could spark another in a neighbor's. Every light bulb switched on in a Burkinabe village could inspire a child in Dakar or Bamako to believe Africa's destiny lay in its own hands. Yet he also knew the stakes. The West feared not just Burkina Faso's independence, but the wildfire it could ignite across Africa. If one small, landlocked nation could break the cycle of dependency, why couldn't dozens more? That fear, he understood, was the root of their hostility. And so Traoré stood before a crowd in Ouagadougou's central square, his voice echoing under the night sky. We will no longer beg for development. We will build it with our own hands. If the world wants to trade, let it be in respect. If the world wants to partner, let it be in equality, but never again in chains. The applause thundered, not just in that square, but across the continent. For many, Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a president. He was becoming a symbol. Weeks later, the first steel beams rose from the soil outside Ouagadougou. Welders in hard hats, many of them young men who once drifted unemployed through the streets, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Indian engineers, learning, building, earning. For the first time in living memory, heavy machinery rumbled, not to extract raw resources for export, but to construct factories that would stay. In Kaya, farmers watched as surveyors mapped land for new irrigation canals. Rumors of tractors and modern harvesters spread through villages like wildfire. In Bobo Dioulasso, young women enrolled in training programs, determined to become the first generation of Burkinabe engineers shaping their nation's future. The transformation was slow, imperfect, and still fragile, but it was visible. And visibility, in a country long denied hope, was power. Still, foreign pressure mounted. A leaked European memo described Burkina Faso as a test case that must be contained before the African awakening spreads. Western media questioned whether Traoré was drifting into authoritarianism, attempting to frame his leadership not as liberation, but as danger. Traoré answered, not with arguments, but with evidence. He invited journalists, African, Indian, even skeptical Westerners, to walk through construction sites, to meet the workers, to speak with families whose children now studied under electric light. He wanted the proof to be undeniable. Burkina Faso was not a pawn, it was a builder. But privately, he wrestled with a question that no headline could answer. Could trust be sustained? Trust from the people, trust from partners, trust from Africa itself. The pact with India was bold, but boldness without vigilance could still collapse into disappointment. One evening, addressing his cabinet, Traoré did not speak as a president, but as a soldier. We are at war, not only with poverty, not only with terrorism, but with history itself. Too many times our dreams were stolen. This time, we must protect them with discipline, with unity, with sacrifice. His ministers sat in silence, knowing he was not speaking of policy, but of destiny. Just as optimism spread across Burkina Faso, a chilling revelation surfaced. A confidential intelligence brief leaked from within Traoré's own government suggested that the $15 billion oil pact might not be as straightforward as it seemed. Hidden clauses, buried deep in the legal text, hinted that India would hold exclusive control over certain export rights for decades. The leak ignited a storm. Critics accused Traoré of trading one master for another. Markets panicked. Opposition figures demanded an inquiry, and whispers of betrayal swept across Ouagadougou. "Have we exchanged French chains for Indian ones?" became the question on every tongue. Traoré, unflinching, called an emergency press conference. Holding the contract aloft, he spoke to the nation. "Yes, there are risks. But let me be clear, no nation will own us again. If there are clauses that threaten our sovereignty, we will renegotiate them. If there are traps, we will dismantle them. But we will not return to silence, we will not return to dependence." The declaration calmed some, but not all. Doubt had been planted. Whether the leak was genuine or engineered by foreign hands remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was this: the battle was no longer only external. It was now also internal, a struggle for trust, truth, and unity. But then, another revelation shattered the doubt. Investigators traced the leak back to a European lobbying group tied to oil giants in France and the United States. The so-called hidden clauses had been deliberately distorted before being pushed into the media. It was not truth, it was sabotage, crafted to fracture confidence in Ibrahim Traoré and derail Burkina Faso's rise. The trap backfired. When the truth came out, the people's anger no longer targeted Traoré, it turned outward. Crowds flooded the streets of Ouagadougou carrying banners. "Burkina Faso is not for sale." Farmers, teachers, soldiers, and students marched together, chanting his name. Traoré seized the moment. Standing on the balcony of the presidential palace, he declared, "You see, brothers and sisters, the fear of our enemies is not about oil, not about contracts, it is about our awakening. They fear a Burkina Faso that decides its own path. They fear an Africa that refuses to bow." End quote. The twist was complete. What began as a potential scandal transformed into a crucible of unity. Far from weakening him, the attempted smear campaign elevated Ibrahim Traoré into something greater. Not just the president of Burkina Faso, but the embodiment of resistance against manipulation. Global analysts were forced to admit it. The West had underestimated him. Instead of isolating Traoré, their tactics had turned him into a symbol of African sovereignty, a living reminder that the continent's future would not be negotiated in Paris, Washington, or Brussels, but in Ouagadougou. Years passed, and the transformation was undeniable. Factories hummed across Burkina Faso, powered by pipelines that stretched like lifelines through the heart of the country. Steel mills forged jobs and futures for thousands, while training centers molded the next generation of engineers and innovators. Villages that once endured darkness now shone with electricity. Markets bustled not with despair, but with opportunity. Across Africa, leaders watched and learned. Ghana, Mali, Senegal all saw what courage, vision, and unwavering sovereignty could achieve. Africa News was no longer a story of exploitation or failure. It became a story of resurgence, a testament to what was possible when a nation refused to bow. Ibrahim Traoré stood once more in the central square of Ouagadougou. His gaze swept over the people, the factories, the schools. He raised his voice, carrying a promise and a truth. "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up to win it." And in that moment, Burkina Faso was not just a country, it was a symbol, a beacon, a bridge for an entire continent choosing its own destiny. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to follow the journey of an Africa that no longer bows its head. God bless Africa.